G'day, mate. Luke Ford here. I want to talk more from this excellent book by scholar Mark B. Shapiro, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. So, as I mentioned in the first show on this theme, Christians in the first 3 centuries were already killing each other in disputes over theology. By contrast, Judaism was approximately 3,000 years old before a rabbi came along and codified what it is that Jews must believe. So even though Maimonides was not the first rabbi to do so, he was the first rabbi that other rabbis paid attention to when he did this. So talking about the second principle, so that's the unity of God. So let's just look here really quick for the Rambam's 13 principles of the Jewish faith. So principle number 1 is belief in the existence of God, who is perfect and is the primary cause of all that exists. Principle number 2 is the belief in God's absolute and unparalleled unity. Principle number 3 is the belief in God's non-corporeality, that God cannot become flesh, that he will not be affected by any physical occurrences. 4 is belief in God's eternity. 5th essential principle of the Jewish faith is the imperative to worship God exclusively and no foreign false gods. Number 7, the belief in the primacy of the prophecy of Moses, that Moses was the greatest of the prophets. 8, belief in the divine origins of the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses. 9, belief in the immutability of the Torah, that it can never be superseded. 10, the belief in God's omniscience and providence, that God knows all. 11, belief in divine reward and retribution. Number 12, the belief in the arrival of the Messiah and of the Messianic era. Number 13, the belief in the resurrection of the dead. So those are the 13 essential principles. So I'm reading from Mark Shapiro now on principle number 2. And there was this bloke, Abraham Miguel Cardozo, who lived 1626 to 1706. He believed that the hidden God, called the first cause, is entirely removed from any contact with the world. So according to Cardozo, it is the demiurge, the God of Israel, who created the world and exercises providence. In other words, it was this demiurge, not the first cause, who appeared to the patriarchs, sent the plagues, and took the Israelites out of Egypt. And it is this demiurge that prayer should be addressed, according to Abraham Miguel Cardozo. So Rabbi Isaac Lopez of Aleppo in the 17th century saw nothing heretical in Cardozo's view. Lopez even advocated this position himself, quoting from Cardozo's unpublished manuscript. He stated that he was unaware of the origin of this work. Since he believed that a great Kabbalist had written it, he was able to evaluate his position and find it acceptable. It's true that some scholars reject Lopez's claim that he did not know the identity of the author and regard him as a secret Cardozian. Curious if we have any secret Cardozians watching right now. That the renowned halachist means expert in Jewish law, and Kabbalist, Kabbalah means Jewish mysticism, Rabbi Yosef Chaim ben Elijah al-Hacham of Baghdad, who lived 1832 to 1909, strongly rejects Lopez's Cardozian position, nevertheless had a very high opinion of him. Lopez is also cited a number of times by Rabbi Yaakov Kassin, who lived 1900 to 1994, the late rabbi of Brooklyn's Syrian community. So although Cardozo's view was regarded as heretical in his day, there are outstanding Kabbalists in medieval times who hold a very similar position. Like Cardozo, they believe that the Ilat Ha'ilot has no involvement with human affairs. That means the first cause God, being completely impersonal and transcendent. Therefore, no prayers are directed towards it. Instead, one prays to the God who is immanent, the demiurge, the secondary God who created the world and exercises providence in it. That is the God of the scripture, who is identified with either the first sphera, divine emanation of Keter, or the second sphera, the divine emanation of Chokmah, wisdom. So among the Kabbalistic works which promulgated this opinion, mention should be made of the influential and anonymous Ma'arechet HaElohut, which Gershom Scholem believes was written around the turn of the 14th century. Even if it is incorrect to say that there are two gods in this conception, there is no escaping the fact that there are two supreme powers in the Godhead, precisely what other religious traditions would call two persons. In line with this, Rabbi Isaac ibn Latif, that's 13th century, describes the immanent God, what he terms the first created being, in words that Maimonides would view as blasphemous dualism. First created being, may he be blessed, knows everything by virtue of his essence, for he is everywhere and everything is in him, as it is written, the whole earth is full of his glory, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 3. And all beings exist through him by way of emanation and evolvement. Nothing exists outside of him. So even among mainstream Kabbalists, we still find views very much at odds with Maimonidean conceptions. For example, Rabbi Yaakov the Nazarite, 12th century, claimed that the first three and last three benedictions of the Amidah, the central prayer in Judaism, are directed towards the Sphira Bina, that's emanation of God. The middle blessings are directed to the Tiferet during the day and to the Bina at night. So this belief holds that our prayers are directed towards manifestations of God rather than God himself, which is quite contrary to Maimonides. The renowned Rabbi Abraham ben David Aposker, the Rabbad, lived 1125 to 1198, differs in that he believes that the first three and last three blessings are directed to the supreme deity, the Ilat HaIlot, the first cause, but the middle blessings, which are more personal, are directed to the divine entity, which is the manifestation of the Ilat HaIlot, the creator, the Yotzei Bereshit. The logic behind this position: the early and later blessings contain only praise rather than supplication, and they can therefore be directed towards the Ilot HaIlot, the first cause God. However, in the middle blessings, man beseeches the Lord, and one does not do this with the Hat HaIlot, Ilat, the first cause. While it is true that Ilat HaIlot is the ultimate cause of all, it is not involved in the world in any way and does not hear prayers. Thus, one must direct these prayers to the Creator, who exercises divine providence and whose image man is created. So I hope you're finding this as fascinating as I am. On the issue of prayer, it should be noted that there were some Kabbalists, such as Rabbi Yosef ben Shalom of Barcelona, 13th and 14th centuries, author of a famous commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah, falsely attributed to the Rabbad, who even believed that the Sphirot pray to the Ilat HaIlot, the first cause. With such a view, especially when merged with the popular Kabbalistic notion that the Sphirot do not perceive the true nature of the Ilat HaIlot, the first cause, it becomes increasingly hard to accept the rhetoric that even in the Sphirotic system, the unity of God remains uncorrupted. This is doubly so when we consider the view of the great Kabbalist Rabbi Azriel of Gerona, 13th century, that, with the exception of the first Sphira, which exists eternally with Ilat HaIlot, the other Sphirot all had a beginning in time. The Sphirot, after all, are emanations from God. Furthermore, what is one to make of the assertion by Rabbi Isaac Pilitz in the 19th century that while it is obvious that the Ein Sof, emanation of God, knows the future, since it is not subject to time, it is most likely that the Sphirot, which run the world, do not know the future. Pilitz believed that this is the best solution to the old problem of preserving man's free will in the face of God's knowledge. Non-Kabbalists will find it difficult to understand why views such as this, where the Ein Sof is severed from the Sphirot, do not create a dualism in the divine realm. And the question in the chat is, did I really convert to Judaism? And yes, I did. Finally, there were also Kabbalists who directed prayers to the unique cherub, an anthropomorphic entity of the divine realm, which emanated from or was created by God, and in whose image man is created. Maimonides would no doubt agree with the judgment of Abraham Epstein that this figure eventually evolved into a virtual second God. Concerning prayer to the cherub, Dan writes, the theological necessity dominant in the formulation of the concept of the cherub, that is, the need to have a divine entity as the subject of anthropomorphic descriptions of God, was probably replaced by mystical devotion to this divine power, which in turn was elevated to the previously forbidden role of accepting prayers from the people of Israel. The theological reservations which had motivated earlier thinkers forbidding prayer to an entity with an image and limits did not seem to bother the participants in this later stage of development. So why did I convert to Judaism? I was searching and my life wasn't working, and Judaism struck me as divine truth. So I reached out in a leap of faith and immersed myself in study of Torah and began to meet Jews and talk to rabbis and begin my Jewish journey starting in about 1990. In conclusion, although there is certainly much more that can be said about the nature of Kabbalistic prayer, it is not necessary for our purposes. It is true that the Kabbalists all believed that their detailed speculations on the Godhead did not damage the fundamental unity of God. Yet, from a Maimonidean perspective, which knows only a simple monotheism and a simple divine unity, they indeed violated the intent, if not the letter, of the second principle. The second principle, once again, is the unity of God. Okay, principle number 3 is the incorporeality of God, meaning that God cannot take human flesh. The third principle teaches God's incorporeality, that God is without image and form. That's why Jews react so negatively towards the idea that God could become human flesh in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. According to Maimonides, this principle includes the assertion that God cannot be described as being in movement or at rest, for this would mean that he has form and physical dimensions. Although, as we shall see, the Bible and the Talmud speak of a corporeal God, Maimonides' philosophical outlook forced him to insist on divine incorporeality. This is so because a corporeal God is a contradiction in terms, as it is impossible for a corporeal God to have the defining characteristics set down in the first and second principles. Maimonides also states that God, omnipotent though he is unable to assume corporeal form. Maimonides goes even further and states that one who believes in God's corporeality is worse than some type of idolater. The Rabbi Shem Tov ben Yosef ibn Shem Tov of the 15th century, one of Maimonides' standard commentators, explains this strong statement as follows. The idolater Maimonides refers to at least believes in an incorporeal God, the idol being merely an intermediary or something that has the power to do good or evil. However, a corporealist denies God's existence entirely, for a corporeal being is, by definition, not the deity. Arthur Hyman has pointed out that in insisting, as did the Olamad rulers, that the masses be taught God's incorporeality, Maimonides is imparting metaphysical truths which have no political expediency. According to Hyman, this stands as a refutation of Lawrence Berman's thesis that Maimonides' purpose in imparting these metaphysical truths was political in nature without any intrinsic value for the masses. So, I'm not speaking to the masses here, I'm speaking to the elite. Whether Maimonides' purpose in teaching the masses the doctrine of an incorporeal God was to instill part of the knowledge required for them to attain immortality, was designed to make possible perfect halakhic observance. Halakha refers to Jewish law, was meant to ensure the Jews' dhimmi, secondary status, makes no difference when one is actually confronted with a corporealist. According to all understandings in Maimonides, such a person cannot attain immortality. This is an important point. Now, I will simply note in support of Berman's thesis that the dhimmi status, the secondary status of the Jews in Islamic lands, would indeed have been endangered had they held to a corporeal conception of God. It means that they could very well have been slaughtered for idolatry. Contrary to Hyman's assertion, the principle of God's incorporeality certainly did have political expediency. According to Hyman, not simply this principle, but all of the principles dealing with God are intended to impart to the masses knowledge of divine things, thus ensuring them some measure of immortality. Yet would Maimonides ever agree that the masses could attain immortality simply through affirmations lacking any cognitive content, that is, without any actualization of the intellect? At the most, we can say that the principles are directed towards those non-intellectuals who have the potential of actualizing the intellect, referring to my viewers. After all, there are gradations of intellectual attainment. Even one who is not a scholar can achieve some understanding of these principles, even though his initial, to a large extent, even continuing acceptance of them was due to tradition. This is what Maimonides means when, after reviewing his efforts at popularizing religious truth, he writes, "They, the philosophically illiterate," I hope we don't have any among you in the chat who are philosophically illiterate or prone to exhibiting homosexual tendencies, will no longer cast the knowledge of God behind their backs, but will exert themselves to the limit of their power to attain what will perfect them and bring them nearer to their Creator. Maimonides also has this population in mind when he writes, "Aren't Jews an ethnic people, so how can you become one of them?" Yes, Jews are an ethnic people, but there's always been a process laid open for people who want to join the tribe. It's not an easy process. Fewer than 100 people attain an Orthodox conversion in the United States each year. So in terms of numbers, number of converts is completely insignificant. In the Bible, you'll see conversion when Boaz gets Ruth to convert and join the tribe so that he can marry her. And there's that famous saying, I think Ruth says to her mother-in-law, "Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people." Maimonides says, "Accordingly, if we never in any way acquire an opinion through following traditional authority, and were not correctly conducted toward something by means of parables, but were obliged to achieve a perfect representation by means of essential definitions, and by pronouncing true only that which is meant to be pronounced true in virtue of a demonstration, which would be impossible except after the above mentioned lengthy preliminary studies, this state of affairs would lead to all people dying without having known whether there is a deity for the world, whether there is not, much less whether a proposition should be affirmed with regard to him or a defect denied. Nobody would ever be saved from this perdition except one of a city or two of a family." We thus see that for Maimonides, immortality is not exclusively for philosophers. Yet, all of Maimonides' efforts notwithstanding, it also seems clear that the mass of simple people who, especially in medieval times, constituted the overwhelming majority of Jews, have no hope of attaining the Maimonidean world to come. So I'm just curious how many in my chat have any hope of attaining the Maimonidean world to come. The limits of their power are simply not sufficient to attain any real apprehension of the divine things that are the key to immortality. So perhaps Maimonides is talking about the crowd with an IQ under 115. Returning to the principle, it must be stressed that contrary to popular belief, the notion that God is incorporeal was not always a unanimously accepted Jewish or Christian or Muslim view. Before examining the particulars of this corporealism, should be obvious to all that Maimonides' insistence on God's incorporeality contradicts a simple reading of the Bible. Here, God is frequently described as a physical being with a back, a head, and a hand. Indeed, nowhere in the Bible does it state that God is incorporeal or invisible for that matter. Even Deutero-Isaiah, whose prophecies speak of a transcendent and all-powerful God, only states, "To whom then will ye liken God? O what likeness will ye compare to him?" This is not a denial that God has a form, only that this form is unlike anything else. Similarly, when Deuteronomy chapter 4:15 states, "You saw no manner of form on the day that the Lord spoke to you in Horeb out of the midst of the fire," this is not a denial of divine corporeality, only a statement that God's form was not seen. So let's take a break here from all this intense Jewish philosophy and listen to a little John Mearsheimer on nuclear strategy and power.
Now, let's talk about the United States. The United States, as was clear from much of the discussion this morning, has long had a first-use policy. And there is no evidence that we're giving up that first-use policy. That first-use policy is inextricably tied to extended deterrence. During the Cold War, the United States took it upon itself to put its nuclear umbrella over Germany, mainly, in Central Europe, and over Korea, South Korea, and Japan in East Asia. We didn't want them to have nuclear weapons. We did not, for good strategic reasons, want them to have a trigger on a finger on a nuclear trigger, so we extended deterrence to them. That meant we had to be willing to use nuclear weapons to come to their rescue in case their survival was threatened. That involved a first-use policy. And once you have a first-use policy, you better think about nuclear advantage, because you may have to use those weapons first.
Curious if anyone in the chat has a first-use policy. My brothers in philosophy here. Okay, let's get back to this exciting principle 3 of Maimonides' 13 essential principles. Let's talk about God's incorporeality. While not denying God's corporeality, the Bible does, however, state that seeing the Lord is hazardous to one's health. As God says to Moses, "Thou canst not see my face, for man shall not see me and live." Even before God said this, Moses was aware that seeing God was not easily accomplished. As Exodus chapter 3, verse 6 states, "And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God." The danger present in gazing upon God is also expressed by Isaiah, who, after seeing God sitting on his throne, exclaimed, "Woe is me, for I am undone, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Isaiah nevertheless survived this experience, as did Moses, whom the Pentateuch describes as having beheld the likeness of the Lord. Prophet Micah was also able to proclaim, "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne." From the perspective of Maimonides and his followers, all of these verses obviously have to be understood figuratively. In the words of Rabbi Menachem Meiri, 1249 to 1316, the principles of faith are not tied to the literal meaning of scripture and Aggadot. So Jewish literature in form contains two forms. There's halakhic, meaning legal, and Aggadot, meaning stories. As for the fairness of condemning as heretics those simpletons who do not know any better and take these biblical descriptions of God literally, Maimonides writes, okay, so how many of you are simpletons who take these biblical descriptions of God literally? Press 1 in the chat if you're a simpleton. If, however, you should say that the external sense of the biblical text causes man to fall into this doubt regarding God's incorporeality, you ought to know that an idolater is similarly impelled to his idolatry by imaginings and defective representations. Accordingly, there is no excuse for one who does not accept the authority of men who inquire into the truth and are engaged in speculation, if he himself is incapable of such speculation. That refers to the crew with an IQ under 115. I hope I don't have any people in the chat even watching or listening to this who have IQs under 115. If you have an IQ under 115, please stop listening now. I do not consider as an infidel one who cannot demonstrate that the corporeality of God should be negated. But I do consider as an infidel one who does not believe in its negation, and this particularly in view of the existence of the interpretations of Onkelos and of Jonathan ben Uziel, may peace be on both of them, who caused their readers to keep away as far as possible from the corporeality of God. So press 2 in the chat if you are an infidel, and I will dispatch the appropriate response to your home address. Maimonides is correct in asserting that the Targumim, that's a rabbinic commentary from about 2,000 years ago, often shy away from anthropomorphism, but this is hardly the case with Talmudic and Midrashic literature. In this literature, there are numerous descriptions of God as a corporeal being, one of the most famous being the Babylonian Talmud Brachot 6a, which describes God as wearing tefillin. Now, if you want to download all of Jewish text in an app, it is called the Sefaria app. That's Sefaria. So this app will give you the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and translate it into English. You can study the entire Talmud. You can study the entire corpus of Judaism in this app, and it's freely available even to Gentiles. As with the biblical descriptions of God's corporeality, Maimonides understood all of the rabbinical passages in a figurative way. So if you understand rabbinic passages in a literal way, press 3. If you're with the Rambam, Maimonides, you understand them in a figurative way, press 4. As he put it, the doctrine of the corporeality of God did not ever occur, even for a single day, to the sages. May their memory be blessed. And this was not, according to them, a matter lending itself to imagination or to confusion. Press 5 if you suffer from imagination and confusion. But is this the only way to read these texts? Isn't there a prohibition to death for Gentiles to read the Talmud? I don't think so. It's not really operating today, but hey, even if it is, it's worth it. Go ahead, dig in. Better for you to study a little Talmud and die than to go the rest of your life without Talmud study. It would seem not, for there is little doubt that a popular view in rabbinic times was that God indeed had a form. Because medieval theology has been so influential, this statement will no doubt surprise many. Okay, press 7 if you agree that in rabbinic times there was a popular view that God had a form. Yet, as Alon Goshen Gottstein has pointed out, in all of rabbinic literature, there is not a single statement that categorically denies that God has body or form. Whoa, bro, cool it with the anti-Semitism. What about the workers? Furthermore, there is absolutely no objection in all of rabbinic literature to the idea that man was created in the image of God's physical form. Let's get a little John Mearsheimer on nuclear strategy.
Situation is not going to change in the emerging multipolar world because we are going to extend deterrence to both South Korea and Japan for the foreseeable future. So I would say to you, given that the United States is tied to a first use policy and that we're surely going to seek nuclear advantage in the future, you can rest assured we're going to arms race with all the other great powers in the system. And in this multipolar world, that means China and Russia. Second reason it makes sense to arms race for advantage is even if you don't have an explicit or immediate need for a first strike capability, you want to have that capability in reserve because a rainy day may come along and you may need to think about initiating nuclear use. And when that's the case...
Okay, press 1 in the chat if you're thinking about initiating nuclear use. Okay, I've not lost it. All right. Furthermore, there is absolutely no objection in all of rabbinic literature to the idea that man was created in the image of God's physical form. Although this last statement would seem to be an exaggeration, it is not far off the mark, as can be seen from Yair Lobobaum's recent exhaustive study of the subject. Press 1 in the chat if you have read Yair Lobobaum's recent exhaustive study of the subject. Furthermore, as Goshen Gottstein has stressed, there are some examples in rabbinic literature that are very difficult to understand metaphorically. Indeed, they seem to show that show clearly that at least some of the rabbinic sages believed in divine corporeality. In Vayikra Rabbah, that's a rabbinic commentary from about 3,000 years ago, we are told of Hillel, who was on his way to the bathhouse. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, where are you going?" He said to them to perform a commandment. They said to him, "And what then is this commandment?" He said to them, "To bathe in the public bath." They said to him, "And is this a commandment?" And he said to them, "Yes. The man who is appointed to take care of the images of kings, which the Gentiles set up in their theaters and circuses, scours them and rinses them, and they provide his livelihood. And not only that, but he occupies an important place among government officials. How much more I, who was created in the image, Selim, and in the likeness, Demut, of God." Goshen Gottstein also calls attention to Avot de Rabbi Natan, where in a list of people born circumcised, Adam is listed first. The proof text is that he was created in the image of God. This proof text would only work if the correspondence between man's body and the divine body is understood to be exact. Another good example is found in Rosh Hashanah 24b and Avodah Zarah 43b. This is the Babylonian Talmud. In explaining why it is forbidden to make a portrait of man, the proof text cited is Exodus 20:20. "You shall not make with me," which is read, "You shall not make me." That is, since God is made in man's image, you cannot reproduce the human face, because by doing so, you will be doing the same with God's face. In other words, the human face is a literal copy of God's face. All right, I need to figure out how many Gentiles do I have watching and how many chosen ones. So press 1 if you're not chosen, press 2 if you're chosen. Meir Bar Ilan has also studied the relevant rabbinic literature and come to an identical conclusion, namely that in the first centuries, Jews in the land of Israel and in Babylon believed in an anthropomorphic God. In fact, 2 generations ago, Arthur Marmorstein concluded that there was a school in Judaism, and an important one too, that believed in a God who accompanies man in human form and shape. Marmorstein also points to the school of Rabbi Ishmael, which, according to him, did not understand God in this manner. However, neither Goshen Gottstein nor Bar Ilan sees any evidence to justify the conclusion that Rabbi Ishmael's school did not share an anthropomorphic conception of God. Okay, let's get some Mearsheimer.
Maximum military advantage. Let me give you an example. If a great power is involved in a conventional war with a rival great power, and it comes to believe that its territorial integrity or its survival is being threatened, I think there's a good chance that that great power is going to want to think about initiating nuclear use to rescue itself. Almost everybody agrees that great powers are likely to use nuclear weapons when they feel their survival is threatened. And great powers are remarkably sensitive about attacks on their homeland and attacks on allies that live close to them. And you can imagine situations where a great power may want to rescue a situation by initiating nuclear use. Then there's always the possibility, if you see a rival great power.
Okay, so if you're thinking of initiating nuclear use, I want you to call 911 and turn yourself in. All right, this is a text from Rabbi Ishmael, and he appears to be referring to an anthropomorphic God. This is how you are to make it, Genesis 6:15. It teaches that God pointed out to Noah with his finger and told him, "Like this you shall make it." It has been taught, Rabbi Ishmael said, 5 fingers in the right hand of God, all are a great secret. The little finger, with it God showed Noah what to do. The second finger, next to the little one, with it God smote the Egyptians. The third finger, the middle one, with it God wrote the tables. The fourth finger, the index, with it God showed to Moses what Israel should give to save their souls. The whole hand, with it the Lord will ruin the children of Esau, that are his foes, and destroy the children of Ishmael that are his enemies. As it is written, your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries. And it is also written, in that day the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time. A revealing passage, which is not cited by Goshen Gottstein or Bar Ilan, appears in Midrash Tanhuma and the Pesifta Derav Kahana. Isaiah said, "Seek ye the Lord while he may be found." King David said, "Seek ye the Lord and his strength." What did he have in mind in going on to say in the same verse, "Seek his face continually"? To teach you that the Holy One, may his name be blessed, is at times seen and at times not seen. Thus he showed himself to Moses, as it is said, and the Lord spoke unto Moses face to face. But then God turned away and hid from him, so that Moses had to say, "Show me, I pray you, your glory." He likewise showed himself to Israel at Sinai, as it says, "They saw the God of Israel, and the appearance of the glory of the God was like a devouring fire." But then God turned away and hid from them, as it is said, "Take ye therefore good heed unto yourselves, for you saw no manner of form, and ye heard the voice of words, but you saw no form." According to this passage, the anti-anthropomorphic verses in Deuteronomy, which state that God's form was not seen, only refer to a time when God chose to turn away. At other times, as the text clearly states, God was indeed visible. Because Adam was created in the image of God, and thus looks like him, Bereshit Rabbah reports that even the angels were confused. Rabbi Hoshea said, "When the Holy One, blessed be he, created Adam, the ministering angels mistook him for God and wished to exclaim, 'Holy,' before him. What does this resemble? A king and a governor who sat in a chariot, and his subjects wished to say to the king, 'Sovereign,' but they did not know which it was. What did the king do? He pushed the governor out of the chariot, and so they knew who was king." Similarly, when the Lord created Adam, the angels mistook him for God. What did the Holy One, blessed be he, do? He caused sleep to fall upon him, so all knew that he was but a mortal man. Rabbi Shimon said, when Isaac was bound to the altar, he lifted his eyes and saw the Shekinah, the divine presence. But it is written, "Man may not see me and live." In lieu of death, his eyes dimmed when he got older, as it says, "When Isaac was old and his eyes were too dim." From here, you learn that blindness is considered as death. Let's get some more Mearsheimer.
Its nuclear forces, and that great power has vulnerable nuclear forces, and you know that great power is in a use them or lose them situation. You want to take out that arsenal as quick as you can. I'll talk more about this later, but this is the great danger that China runs. Has a quite vulnerable nuclear arsenal, gets into a crisis with the United States. The United States thinks it has a first strike capability, have very powerful incentives here in Washington to take out those Chinese nuclear forces before they can be used. Is this likely to happen? No. I'm just saying it's a serious possibility. And if you're the United States of America, you want to have the capability, should that event arise, and should you feel compelled to do it. Furthermore.
Okay, back to Mark B. Shapiro. His terrific book, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. So it's hard to understand these passages that I just read as meaning anything other than Isaac actually gazed upon God's presence. Yes, I have a cold. Yes, my lower back went out. Yes, I am a wreck. Yes, I'm trying to distract myself from my cold, from my sore back, from my misery, from my fever and confusion by streaming. So I'm not responsible for anything I say and do on this stream. Matters are necessarily more complicated than I am able to summarize here, and it is possible to argue, following Goshen Gottstein, that at least some rabbinic passages reflect the notion that God's body is a divine body of light rather than a corporeal body. Still, it seems impossible to deny that a widespread rabbinic view was that God does, in fact, have a physical body, even if it is more perfect than the human body that is modeled on it. So I'm just waiting for the debut of the last season of Game of Thrones. So until then, I will continue to distract myself from worldly matters by bathing my soul here in the well springs of Torah. Josephus is also part of the anthropomorphic tradition. Press 1 if you are also part of the anthropomorphic tradition, as he clearly implies that God has a form, although it is beyond our powers of comprehension. By his works and bounties he is plainly seen, indeed more manifest than all else, but his form and magnitude surpass our powers of description. You know what my deepest fear is? That I threw my back out like wielding my cricket bat, twirling it around, and such a wonderful prop for my show. And now, as a result, my back is twerked and twicked and picked and maybe that wonderful cricket bat, all those years without playing cricket, just picking it up again and twirling it around. It's like, oh. That would be so sad after I invested $40 in that cricket bat. No materials, however, costly, are fit to make an image of God. No art has skill to conceive and represent it. The like of him we have never seen, we do not imagine, and it is impious to conjecture. So, what can we say about the views of the masses during rabbinic times? So, press 1 if you're part of the masses. Press 2 if you're part of the inner party. Philo, who thanks to Greek philosophical influence was a strong anti-anthropomorphist. Press 3 if you are a strong anti-anthropomorphist. Claims that the biblical anthropomorphisms are for the benefit of those who are very dull in their natures. Press 4 if you are very dull in your natures, so as to be utterly unable to form any conception whatever of God apart from a body. He goes on to say, in opposition to what Maimonides would later argue, that we must be content if such men can be brought to a proper state by the fear which is held over them by such descriptions. So press 5 if you have a fear of being described as very dull in your nature. It would appear from this that anthropomorphisms among the masses was not uncommon in Philo's day. Evidence for this from a later period can be found in the anthropomorphic representations of God's hand extending from heaven, which appear in the excavated synagogues of Dura Europos in the 3rd century and Beit Alpha in the 6th century. One of my favorite parts of the Torah is when the high priests of Egypt say they see the finger of God. Remember that? I'm like too much of a holy man to illustrate which finger I believe that God was giving them. It is also significant that Justin Martyr, 2nd century, sounds like a Christian, sounds like a Goy, right? Only a Goy would be named Justin Martyr. Describes the Jews as believing that God has hands and feet and fingers and a soul like a composite creature. Press 7 in the chat if you know anyone with the last name of Martyr. Yet, despite all the evidence that many Jews in rabbinic times believed in some form of divine corporeality, I believe that there are also significant segments of the Jewish world which worshipped an incorporeal God. The evidence for this comes from descriptions of Jewish life and worship by Greek and Latin authors. For example, a very early writer, Hecatus of Abdera, 4th century BCE, reports that Moses was of the opinion that God has no human form. While this perhaps leaves open the possibility that God has some other form, Strabo, 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, writes that Moses taught that the Egyptians were mistaken in representing the divine being by the images of beasts and cattle, for according to him, God is the one thing alone that encompasses us all and encompasses land and sea. Livy, 58 BCE to 17 CE, states flatly that the Jews do not think that God partakes of any figure. Tacitus, 55 CE to 117 CE, It means common era, also reports that according to the Jews, God is incapable of representation and without end. Seems most unlikely that a few philosophically oriented Jews of Philo's ilk could have decisively influenced these writers' judgment. These authors, who would have been more than happy to report that the Jews, or at least a great number of them, were corporealists, offer a very different perspective. Earlier, I noted that Maimonides believed that all anthropomorphic descriptions of God in the Torah must be understood figuratively. However, Maimonides also pointed out that anthropomorphic conceptions of God were indeed held in biblical times, even by some important figures. I shall discuss his shocking explanation as to why the Torah uses anthropomorphic expressions. Here I simply wish to call attention to Maimonides' understanding of Exodus 24, 9-11. Then went up Moses and Aaron and Nadav and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet the like of a paved work of sapphire stone, and the like of the very heaven for clearness, and upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand, and they beheld God, and did eat and drink. According to Maimonides, it was only Nadav and Abihu and the 70 elders who are described by this text as seeing God. Had the text only mentioned this, it would not have been exceptional. As Moses was also described as seeing God, Maimonides interprets this figuratively. However, this text also speaks of them observing something under God's feet. According to Maimonides, this shows that their apprehension of God was marred, inasmuch as corporeality entered into it to some extent, this being necessitated by their over-hasty rushing forward before they had reached perfection. For this, they deserve to perish. Okay, press 1 in the chat if you deserve to perish. Press 2 if you deserve to perish because of your over-hasty rushing forward before you have reached perfection. According to Albo, Isaiah also almost fell victim to this error. I've already quoted Isaiah 6:5, where we read that Isaiah saw God and feared that it would be his undoing. Instead of trying to explain Isaiah's vision, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up. In a philosophical manner, Albo claims that Isaiah, through his power of imagination, really did envision a corporeal God. This was because his prophetic ability was not as exalted as that of Moses. So I think it's the seventh principle of the Jewish faith, according to Maimonides, that Moses was the greatest of the prophets. Isaiah realized his error, according to Albo, and exclaimed, "Woe is me, for I am affected by imagination." Press 9 in the chat if you are affected by imagination. Albo explains, the meaning is, I am affected by the power of imagination, and my prophetic inspiration is not through a luminous glass like that of Moses, who heard a voice speaking to him without seeing any image before his eyes. According to the Talmud, this utterance of Isaiah, which contradicted Moses' statement, "For men shall not see me and live," was one of the reasons Manasseh slew him. While on the subject of Isaiah's vision, it should be noted that a desire to view God need not imply that God has an actual physical form. Elliot R. Wolfson, in his justly praised book, Through a Speculum That Shines, Vision and Imagination in Medieval Jewish Mysticism. Wow, I have been so adversely affected by my time reporting on the news in the San Fernando Valley, as it's hard for me to read a title of a learned theological work that says, "Through a Speculum That Shines." Anyway, Through a Speculum That Shines has provided us with numerous examples of mystics imagining God in anthropomorphic ways, though this hardly means that they regarded God as having a corporeal form. So press 1 if you're a mystic, press 2 if you're a rationalist, press 3 if you're an empiricist. it is obvious that they were simply imagining him this way. Although this would certainly not be to Maimonides' liking, since these mystics believed in an incorporeal God, there was no violation of the third principle. Despite Maimonides' forceful attacks against the belief in divine corporeality, he did not immediately succeed in uprooting it. Furthermore, there were a number of scholars in medieval times who were corporealists, which should not surprise us, since they were simply following the rabbinic tradition already described. This led Rabbi Abraham ben David the Rabbad to his famous defense of the corporealists. Why has Maimonides called such a person a heretic? There are many people greater and superior to Maimonides who adhere to such a belief on the basis of what they have seen in verses of scripture, and even more in the matters of those agadot, meaning stories, which corrupt right opinion about religious matters. Although, unfortunately, we do not have much in the way of written records from these corporealists, there are a number of texts that enlighten us. The most significant is the Ketav Tamim of Rabbi Moses ben Hasdai Taku, a Tosafos. So the Tosafos, what? When did we have the Tosafos? And they were a jolly bunch of scholars, all right? So the Tosafos were medieval rabbis from France and Germany, who are among those known in Talmudic scholarship as the Rishonim. Okay, the Rishonim means the first ones. There were Rishonim in Spain also, and they all created critical and explanatory glosses, meaning questions, notes, interpretations, rulings, and sources on the Talmud. These were collectively called Tosafot editions, because they were additions on the commentary of Rashi. So the Tosafos lived from the 12th century to the middle of the 15th century, and the Tosafot are a compilation of the questions, answers, and opinions of those rabbis. The Tosafot are very important to the practical application of Jewish law, because the law will differ depending on how the Talmud is understood and interpreted. Although there is some dispute as to how extreme an anthropomorphous Taku was, there is no question that he rejected Maimonides' third principle and viewed God as having an image and form, or at least able to assume these at will. Thus, according to him, when the Bible states that various prophets saw God, means that they literally beheld the Creator. The philosophical objections raised against such a position were of no significance when contradicted by explicit biblical and rabbinic texts, which attest to both God's omnipotence and his corporeality. Directing his ire at Maimonides, Taku writes, "Is it at all proper for a believer in the Torah to say the Torah speaks in the language of man?" Taku's literalism is so extreme that he views as blasphemous the rationalist denial that God literally sits on his throne. After all, the Babylonian Talmudic tractate Rosh Hashanah 31a clearly states, in Taku's version, on the sixth day they said, "The Lord reigns, he is clothed in majesty. He completed his work and ascended and sat on his royal throne in heaven." Responding to the view popularized by Saadia Gaon and the Hasidei Ashkenaz, and quite popular today, that God's presence is to be found everywhere, Taku writes, "Heaven forbid that the Holy One of all holiness should be found in a place of filth and in the midst of idols." The Torah writes, "Therefore shall thy camp be holy, that he see no unseemly thing in you and turn away from you." So I remember listening to a rabbi lecture on this, and so I said to him, so if I go to nightclubs where nobody has probably ever said a bracha, should I go in and say a bracha? Should I go into discos and say a bracha to try to bring holiness to these degenerate places? And the rabbi said, "Luke, you should do that." So that's what I'm doing, bringing holiness to the degeneracy so widespread on YouTube. Thus, the Torah testifies that God is not found in unfitting places, like some of the rival streams to this one. To my rival streams, God is not found. It's obvious here, it's scripture. Do Orthodox Jews have to learn Yiddish or Hebrew language? Yes. Orthodox Jews, almost by definition, know Hebrew, And if they're raised traditional, then they likely know Yiddish as well, traditional Hasidim. God can at times be found in a definite place, according to Taku, and indeed he does not need to be everywhere to know that he has brought about. For this is his greatness, that he is above all and knows all and is nevertheless close to all. How then does this square with Jeremiah 23:24? Do not I fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord? According to Taku, the greatness of God is seen in the fact that while filling the world, excluding the filthy areas, like those rival streams going on right now, filthy, degenerate, filthy, possible homosexual tendencies, God is not found there. Whoa! Thank you for the God-centered $15 super chat. According to Taku, the greatness of God is seen in the fact that while filling the world, excluding the filthy areas of my rival streamers with his majesty, he can still occupy one place. In support of his anthropomorphic conception, Taku cites an interesting Talmudic passage in Sanhedrin 46b in explaining the Torah's prescription that one who is executed should not hang overnight. Rabbi Meir offered a parable. To what is this matter comparable? To two twin brothers who lived in one city. One was appointed king and the other took to highway robbery. At the king's command, they hanged him. But all who saw him exclaimed, "The king is hanged," whereupon the king issued a command and he was taken down. What do you have to accomplish before you can study Kabbalah? You're supposed to be married with children and over 40 years of age and an observant Jew. In other words, man's physical appearance resembles that of God. What then is one to do with the verse in Isaiah 40:18? To whom then will ye liken God, or what likeness will ye compare unto him? Taku explains that it is stated with reference to God's greatness and the splendor of his glory, but nothing compares to them. The verse does not, however, mean that God has no image. Do Jews follow the Talmud? Orthodox Jews are shaped and their behavior influenced by the Talmud as it's been interpreted and applied down through the centuries. Another significant anthropomorphic text is that of the Sefer Hamuskel, written at the end of the 13th century by Rabbi Solomon Simcha of Troyes, 1235 to 1300, a descendant of Rashi, 1040 to 1105, and a student of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, 1215 to 1293, and Rabbi Peretz of Corbeil, 13th century. According to Rabbi Solomon, this is a major theme of his book, Sefer Hamuskel. God is identical with the air that is found everywhere. In line with this conception, Rabbi Solomon adds, "Blessed be he and blessed be his name," whenever he mentions the air. Rabbi Solomon also claims that in the upper world, the air is of infinite brightness. That's very much like the air here in Los Angeles. It's has a wonderful quality, the light, things because there's so much divine presence here in Los Angeles. And that the sun is a window allowing us to glimpse a portion of God's substance. When God is described in human form, as in prophetic visions, this is not to be interpreted in an allegorical fashion. Rather, God, or more precisely, an element of God, referred to as his Ruach Nifrat, actually assumed such a form. Do Haredi Jewish men spend most of their lives studying Torah and Talmud? Yes. Unless they're stupid. Then there's no point in them spending a lot of time studying Torah and Talmud. It's better for them to take out the trash and sweep the way and do the menial tasks for elite Jews to have time to study Torah. Since Rabbi Solomon's lineage is traced to Rashi, it is not without interest that both Meir Bar Ilan and Israel M. Tashma have recently claimed that even Rashi was a corporealist. Whoa. As proof of this, Bar Ilan points to Rashi's comment that the measurement of the heavenly Torah, which is said to be 3,200 times bigger than the universe, is arrived at by calculating in accordance with the cubit of the Holy One, blessed be he. Not noted by Bar Ilan is that elsewhere in his Talmudic commentary, Rashi refers to both God's face and his arm. In his commentary on Exodus chapter 7, verse 4, "And I will lay my hand upon Egypt," to prevent one from thinking that in this verse hand means simply power, Rashi writes, "An actual hand, yad mamash, to smite them. In his commentary on Genesis 1:26, Rashi states that when the Bible records that man was to be created in God's image, Selem, it means in God's form. This is distinguished from the other biblical expression, which states that man was to be created in God's likeness. According to Rashi, this later expression means that man was created to understand and to be intellectually creative. Press 7 if you are intellectually creative. Both man's physical form and his intellectual ability are modeled on those of God. As if to make sure that no one misunderstands what he is saying, in his comment on the next verse, Rashi writes, "This teaches you that the form that was established for him, man, is the form of the image of his creator." Have I been to a yeshiva? Yes, not full time, but I've taken many classes in a yeshiva. Why do many Kabbalistic rabbis start learning Kabbalah young? Because when you're elite, you can do things that an ordinary Jew cannot do. Are there any Jews who view the Talmud to be blasphemous due to the book being written by man's perception? No, not really. So the traditional view is not that the Talmud is a work of man's perception, but that it's God speaking through man to us. How do Orthodox Jewish men maintain a lifestyle of study and scholarship without working a typical job? Well, some of them have their wives work so that they can then devote themselves to Torah study. That's what I'm looking. Okay, I'm looking for a wife who will work so that I can devote myself to Torah study. And other Jewish men work a job, but they will start the day at synagogue and they'll end the day at synagogue studying Torah. And Makma says, harsh reality, Talmud is just a whole lot of rabbis commenting on the Torah. Well, the Talmud's conception of itself is that it contains the word of God, and that it is figuring out that the Talmudic discussion is participating in the mind of God. You're working out the mind of God by studying Talmud. Martin Lokshin has argued that Rabbi Samuel ben Meir, the Rashbam, who is a very literal, plain meaning of the text kind of guy, lived 1085 to 1174. One of my favorite medieval commentators on the Torah, the Rashbam. Rashi's grandson was also a corporealist. The Rashbam was probably the most literal-minded of the major medieval rabbinic commentators. Torah commentators. His major proof is Rashbam's commentary on Genesis 48:8. Israel saw, even though below that verse it is written he could not see, it is possible to see a person's shape without recognizing the features of his face. So also, man may not see me and live, and I saw the Lord. According to Lokshin, what Rashbam is saying is that while one cannot see God clearly, one can see him in the same way that a partially blind man can see non-detailed images. Lokshin also cites the Rashbam's comment on Leviticus 16:2. For I appear in the cloud upon the ark cover. Rashbam writes, this is to be understood according to its literal meaning, for at all times I am beheld from the midst of the cloud upon the ark cover. And you can also read Rashi's commentaries, I think, in the Sefaria app. Another example of anthropomorphism among medieval European Jews is found in a piyut. The piyutim are liturgical poems. This particular one, published by Ephraim E. Urbach. According to this text, certain names of God are written on God's forehead, which is described as being of gigantic size. The text then continues, God resembles an old man, a handsome man, a Jew, and a sage. Apparently, the author of this poem shared Rabbi Moses Taku's conception of the deity. Another anonymous piyut, which is ancient and to this day is recited at the beginning of the Avoda section in the Sephardi and Hasidic Yom Kippur liturgy, reads, you fashioned a clod of earth in your form. An anthropomorphic conception of God would also appear to be behind the following comment of Rabbi Yaakov Molin. Perhaps Moses' eyes beheld the face of his master God, blessed be he, and he turned to his right, may his master forgive him. Rabbi Joseph Ashkenazi, the inveterate opponent of Maimonides, said, Maimonides wrote in his Sefer, that means book, that anyone who says that God has a form is a heretic. According to this, it is certainly the case that the Torah and the believer of its words are also to be regarded as heretics, because it states there with reference to Moses, the likeness of the Lord doth he behold. They say that God is intellect and does not change, and with this they deny God seeing and hearing things and his speaking. For all these require corporeality, and even more so his descent on Sinai and ascent to the heavens. Is it okay to listen to Share again? Yes, you can listen to Share this week. So the Talmud is considered the word of God? Yes, in effect, in Orthodox Judaism, yes. And then what about passages in the Talmud that contradict each other? The traditional Jewish approach is that these words and these words, they're both the words of the living God, even if they contradict. Do I think there is a biological basis to the Protestant-Catholic divide in Europe? Yeah, I believe religion is downstream from DNA. Okay, back to Mearsheimer.
Or one can imagine plausible scenarios where a great power has incentives to launch a nuclear strike against a nuclear-armed minor power that's acting in threatening ways. And the prospect of having a disarming first strike capability against a minor power is much greater than it is against a great power, because a great power usually has a survivable retaliatory force, not always, but usually. Whereas when you're dealing with minor powers, you're dealing with countries like North Korea or Iran, if it were to get nuclear weapons, you're in the realm of possible first strike scenarios. Third reason that you seek nuclear advantage is because of the possibility that an adversary will use nuclear weapons against you or against an ally. And if that's the case and you have to retaliate, first of all, you want to make sure that the initiator, your adversary, doesn't gain an advantage over you, so you have to check the initiator. But furthermore, if you do get into a nuclear conflict, what you want to do is do everything possible to make sure you have a nuclear advantage so that you can settle that conflict on terms that are favorable to you. Again, I'm not saying that you can achieve that, but you can rest assured that great powers will go to great lengths to make sure they maximize their chances of achieving that capability. Then the final reason that you're going to want to have nuclear advantage is there's always a possibility that a close ally will initiate nuclear use.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to transcend my sickly corporeal state and live in the world of the spirit with you, studying the holy words of our Torah. According to Lokshin, Rambam is saying that while one cannot see God clearly, one can see him in the same way that a partially blind man can see non-detailed images. Okay, the great historian of Jewish philosophy, Henry A. Wolfson, the one who writes about speculums, claimed that very few Jews had a corporeal conception of God in the days of Maimonides. This opinion was supported by J.L. Teicher, who also asserted categorically that no medieval scholar held corporeal views. However, even if we ignore evidence provided by Christians, Muslims, and Karaites, those who do not accept the oral Torah, there are still many sources which indicate that corporealist views of various sorts were widespread among both ordinary people and scholars, especially among Ashkenazi Jews. Saadia Gaon speaks of people who imagine God as a body, and others who, while not attributing a crude corporeality to God, apply to him characteristics such as quantity, quality, and location that only apply to physical beings. Rabbi Abraham ibn Daud from the 12th century reports that masses of Jews believe God to be a material being. Maimonides, who argues so forcefully against the corporealists, himself speaks of numerous people, including the majority of the ignorant who held anthropomorphic views. In a revealing passage in his essay on resurrection, he also writes, I have met some who think they are among the sages of Israel. Press 1 if you think you're among the sages of Israel. By God, they indeed know the way of the law ever since childhood, and they battle in legal discussions, but they are not certain if God is corporeal with eyes, hands, and feet, as the Bible says, or if he has not a body. Others whom I have met in some lands assert positively that he is corporeal and call anyone who thinks differently a non-believer, namely a heretic and an Epicurean. They explain the homilies of the Babylonian Talmud tractate Brachot literally. I have received similar reports of some whom I have not met. And Makmar says, I've listened to many different streams and podcasts, and the most disturbing is David Duke saying that the Talmud speaks disparagingly of Jesus. Yes, there are sections that speak disparagingly of Jesus, including that he sentenced to eternally boiling excrement. So just as there are many harsh things written about Jews and Judaism in the Christian tradition, so too there are many harsh things written about Jesus and Christianity in the Jewish tradition. Both traditions have a lot of harsh things to say about each other. It's not clear that the Talmud is referring to the Jesus of Christian deity, but it may very well be. So what brand of glasses am I wearing? The $20 version that you can find on Amazon that block out blue light, so that I can go from this stream to having a nice, restful viewing of Game of Thrones and then go to sleep. In his Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides states, they accordingly believed in divine corporeality and deemed that if they abandoned this belief, they would give the lie to the biblical text, that they would even make the deity to be nothing at all unless they thought that God was a body provided with a face and a hand, like them in shape and configuration. However, he is, in their view, bigger and more resplendent than they themselves, and the matter of which he is composed is not flesh and blood. Rabbi Yedaya Bedoshi, 13th, 14th centuries, writes that it is well known that in previous generations, before Maimonides was able to reverse matters, the belief in God's corporeality was spread throughout virtually all Israel. Other scholars who testify to corporeal views being held by Jews include Rabbi Isaiah of Trani, died 1260, Rabbi Moses of Salerno, 13th century, Rabbi David Abudam, 13th, 14th centuries, the anonymous author of Ma'ama HaSeichel, Rabbi Shem Tov ben Yosef ibn Shem Tov. Wow, I wonder how he liked going around with that name, if the other kids teased him in school. And Rabbi Isaac ben Yedaya, 13th century, who refers to a faithless Sadducees who say that God is composed of a matter which is finer, purer, and more transcendent than the matter of any shining star. Following in Rabad's path, Rabbi Meir ben Simeon of Narbonne, 13th century, is more sympathetic. After noting that the majority of the masses believe in a corporeal God, he asserts that the verses of the Torah and the prophets cannot mislead one and therefore turn him into a heretic. He therefore assumes that one who is led to his error by misinterpreting the scriptures remains a Jew in good standing. Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, 1092 to 1167, Rabbi David Kimhi, 1160 to 1235, Rabbi Abraham Maimonides, 1186 to 1237, Rabbi Meshulam ben Solomon de Piera, 13th century, Rabbi Samuel Saputo, 13th century, an anonymous 13th century anti-Maimonidean poem, Rabbi Shem Tov Falaquira, Rabbi Isaac ibn Latif, and Rabbi Moses Alashkar, 1466 to 1542, all speak of corporeal conceptions of God being held by scholars. As we see from Rabbi Abraham Maimonides' letter, Some of the scholars did not believe that God has a hand or a face, and in their minds this sufficed to remove them from the charge of corporealism. Yet, as Rabbi Abraham points out, they remain corporealists without realizing it, for they believe that God is literally to be found in a particular place, which by definition means that he has physical dimensions. With regard to scholars and corporealism, a particularly revealing passage is found in Nachmanides' famous letter to the French sages. Nachmanides wrote this letter in an attempt to make peace between the two sides in the Maimonidean controversy. The French rabbis had recently proclaimed a ban on study of Maimonides' guide and the Sefer Hamada, first volume of the Mishneh Torah. This in turn led to indignation among Maimonides' followers and eventually the excommunication of Rabbi Solomon ben Abraham of Montpellier, 13th century, and his pupils, the main antagonists of Maimonidean philosophy. In his attempt to make peace between the two parties, Nachmanides wrote to the French rabbis, "I have heard others say that you have seized upon the Sefer Hamada." This is a work by Maimonides, for it states that there is no physical form or image on high. Assuming this testimony was correct, and it is certainly in line with the evidence mentioned in the previous paragraph, for at least some of the French rabbis, it was not only Maimonides' advocacy of philosophy which was so objectionable, but also his opposition to corporealism. From Nachmanides' letter, we also see that he shared Rabad's view of the matter, namely that while corporealism was incorrect, it was not enough to condemn one as a heretic. Let's go back, get some John Mearsheimer.
One of the reasons we pay so much attention to extended deterrence is because we don't want allies to have their fingers on the trigger, because we don't want an ally to start a nuclear war when it feels its survival is at stake and then drag us into that nuclear war. But that could happen. Not too likely now because extended deterrence works, but you hypothesize a situation where South Korea and Japan both have nuclear weapons and a war breaks out between one of those countries or both of those countries and China, it is possible nuclear weapons could be used. And if the Chinese mainland gets hit with nuclear weapons by the South Koreans or the Japanese, the Chinese might very well strike back at the United States as well as South Korea and Japan. Again, this is why we like extended deterrence. But for those sorts of scenarios.
So questions in the chat, are there differences between progressive American Jews and Israelis? Well, guess what? Same types of Jews who are overwhelmingly progressive in the United States are also progressive in Israel. So Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, who compose about 75–80% of American Jewry, are overwhelmingly on the left. Ashkenazi Jews in Israel are also overwhelmingly on the left. The same type of Jews who push for essentially open borders for the United States push for the exact same thing in Israel. They have demonstrations and oppose the government deporting all those African invaders who entered Israel illegally. So Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews tend to be centrist to right-wing in their politics, whether these Sephardic or Mizrahi Jews are in Israel or in the United States, or in England or France. Rabbi Abraham Klausner, an important 14th to 15th century Austrian Talmudist, was still able to wonder 200 years after Maimonides whether Teku's opinion was the correct one. Even more surprising, in the 15th century, we find that while Rabbi Elijah Domidigo, who died in 1497, acknowledged that denial of God's incorporeality is heretical, he nevertheless argued that if someone believed in a corporeal deity, his belief in the essence of God and in God's eternal attributes would not be damaged. Solid says, American Jews like Philip Roth say that Jews' cultural and ethnic home is Europe. This is in one satirical novel by Philip Roth. So Philip Roth is a novelist who writes a lot of satire. When he said that, it was in a satirical novel. Aren't Netanyahu, Meir Kahane, and Michael Ben Ari all Ashkenazi? I believe so. Still, most Ashkenazi Jews in America, and I believe also in Israel, tend to be on the left. All of Israel's prime ministers are Ashkenazi because Ashkenazim have average IQs around 112. Sephardim have average IQs around 97, and Mizrahi Jews have average IQs around 92. So almost all high-achieving Jews are Ashkenazi. Although it is difficult for post-medieval scholars to sympathize with the anthropomorphist position, this was not the case for the Italian scholar Rabbi Samuel David Luzzatto, who writes, "I reject Maimonides on the issue of corporeality. I have long believed that the earlier generations ascribed to all spirits, souls, angels, God himself, a very refined matter. The early ones ascribed to God and the angels and the souls a very fine spiritual essence, more subtly than anybody known to us, but nevertheless characterized by form and build." Not surprisingly, Luzzatto also attacks Maimonides by pointing out that his dogma condemns as heretics generations of pious Jews who did nothing wrong, but simply believed what they had been taught. Yet, Luzzatto did not advocate a base corporeality, i.e., a God who resembles humans, but a perfected corporeality. He was also certain that one cannot see God and that passages that apply otherwise are to be regarded as figurative. As part of the sage's effort to prevent people from falling into the mistaken notion that God can indeed be seen, points to Exodus 34:23. 3 times in the year shall all men appear before the Lord God, the God of Israel. According to Luzzatto, this text was originally understood as 3 times in the year shall all males see the Lord God, and the Masoretes, following a tradition going back to the Second Temple times, corrected the text. Luzzatto also felt that Maimonides' extreme opposition to corporealism went far beyond his predecessors and was a new position in Judaism. He regarded the Maimonidean position as dangerous, for it undermined traditional beliefs. Rather than corporealism being heresy, as Maimonides claimed, Luzzatto argued that it is the doctrine of incorporeality which, through its association with philosophy, leads to heresy. He thus felt that it would be infinitely better if Jews were to return to the traditional belief in a corporeal God. While they did not go as far as Luzzatto, we find other opponents of Maimonides' harsh condemnation of the simple believers in God's corporeality. These sages follow in the footsteps of Rabbad. It did not regard belief in an incorporeal God as a fundamental principle of faith, denial of which means exclusion from the Jewish people. Rabbi Simeon ben Sema Duran and Rabbi Joseph Albo both argue in this fashion, and like most of their successors, they emphasize that the corporealist, although he is in error, does not know any better. Rabbi Yosef Yavetz, 1435 to 1507, likewise claims that a simple believer punctilious in the performance of mitzvot, who can only conceive of God in a corporeal fashion, is not to be regarded as a heretic. On the contrary, God prefers him to all the philosophers whose faith leaves much to be desired. Rabbi Chaim Hershenson is another scholar who expresses complete agreement with the Rabbad's position. In a fascinating story regarded by Rabbi Moses Hagiz, 1671 to 1751, a simple man in Sfat, a former Portuguese Marrano, meaning Marrano is a Jew who converted to Catholicism but secretly maintained his Jewish identity, brought bread to the synagogue every Friday for God to eat. The synagogue beadle would actually take the bread, but the man was convinced it was God himself who was pleased with his offering. After the local rabbi learned about this, he harshly rebuked the man both for his foolishness and for the great sin he was committing by holding an anthropomorphic conception of God. However, when Rabbi Isaac Luria heard of this, he informed the rabbi that since the destruction of the temple, God's greatest pleasure was when the simple man brought his bread. Since the rabbi had put a stop to this, it was decreed that he should die, and so it happened. Rabbi Moses Cordovero shared Luria's tolerant approach. According to him, the only people who should be regarded as heretics are those who, knowing the teaching of the Torah, nevertheless continue to advocate the corporealist position. Cordovero sees this as parallel to his view that denial of the Sfirot, that means the divine emanations, is only regarded as heresy if one knows that the doctrine is part and parcel of the Torah and still refuses to accept it. Along these lines, Rabbi Kalonimus Kalman Shapira, 1889 to 1943, argues that one who has not yet reached a state of spiritual elevation in which his conception of God is pure is permitted to visualize God in a physical way. As he rises in spiritual sensitivity, this physical image will disappear on its own. Press 1 if you indeed are rising in spiritual sensitivity. And back to a little John J. Mearsheimer.
That you have a nuclear advantage. Because if you get involved in a nuclear war, you don't want to be at a disadvantage. Let me conclude my discussion with just one point. I'm not arguing that nuclear arms racing guarantees that a great power will gain an advantage over its opponents. It's not my argument. My key point is that great powers constantly try to gain nuclear advantage over their rivals, and they do it because there are powerful incentives to do so. Okay, let me switch gears now and talk about the meaning of nuclear advantage. I've said to you up to now that great powers go to great lengths to achieve nuclear advantage. But what exactly is nuclear advantage? And what this really is all about is the question of how you can employ nuclear weapons in a way that gives you an advantage. And my argument is that a great power pursuing nuclear advantage can achieve it in 4 different ways, at least theoretically. And let me tell you what those 4 different ways are. The ideal outcome is to be the only state in the system that has nuclear weapons. Then there's no possibility of retaliation. You're the only state that has nuclear weapons. And you can easily begin to contemplate situations where you would use nuclear weapons because you have a great advantage. You are the only power with nuclear weapons. However desirable this situation is, no state is going to achieve nuclear monopoly in our lifetime. The best outcome a great power can hope for in the contemporary world is to acquire the capability to launch a splendid first strike against each of its nuclear-armed adversaries, or at least some of them. As I said before, it's especially difficult for a great power to achieve a splendid first strike capability against another great power. Because,
man, I'd love to achieve a splendid first strike capability, wouldn't you? In line with this attitude, Rabbi Menachem M. Kasher, 1895 to 1983, writes with reference to how children are instructed. We teach them belief in God in a simple and clear fashion in accordance with their understanding until they mature and are able to understand matters in a more profound way. But there are many who grow up and still retain their earthly education, and they never have the ability to reach a profound understanding of belief in God, in accordance with the approach of Rabbi Saadia Gaon and Maimonides. Can one possibly regard these people as heretics? Have I read the Israel Lobby book by Walter Mearsheimer? Don't think I've read the book. I read the London Review of Books essay upon which that book was based. So how is this nuclear stuff related to the Jewish stuff? Because I'm interested in both. That's the only relation. And I need to take breaks from my reading so I can clear my throat and cough and sneeze and read the chat and check my Twitter. As support for this tolerant viewpoint, Kasher cites the rabbinic saying, "It is written, they have forsaken me and have not kept my law." That is, would that they had forsaken me, but kept my law, since by occupying themselves therewith, the light which it contains would have led them back to the right path. Those who, through no fault of their own, harbor false beliefs about God are not condemned as heretics, but are encouraged to keep the Torah's commandments in the hope that they will eventually be led to the proper theological understanding. Kasher also cites a very relevant passage from the writings of Rabbi Bachya ibn Pakuda, 11th century, which surprisingly was not cited by other defenders of the anthropomorphous. The foolish and simple person will conceive of the Creator in accordance with the literal sense of the scriptural phrase. And if he assumes the obligation of serving his God and strives to labor for his sake, he is excused by reason of his ignorance and lack of understanding. Man is judged only on the basis of his intellectual ability, his powers of discrimination, and his readiness to act. When this same simple man is able to master this knowledge but is heedless of it, then he is liable to be judged accordingly and punished for his inaction and his neglect of the pursuit of knowledge. In the same vein, there is a wonderful tale told by Rabbi Israel ben Shabtai Hapstein, 1733 to 1814, the Maggid of Koznius. So Maggid means preacher. According to the Maggid, after Maimonides proclaimed the corporealist heretics, the souls of many pious Jews who held this view were chased out of heaven. Only after Rabbad defended them were they allowed to return. The Maggid continues by pointing out that it was only Maimonides' ignorance of Kabbalah that led him to his view. He thus did not know that God is clothed in the worlds, and the worlds are the measure of the image of his body, as it says, "Let us make man in our image." Though the Maggid's quasi-pantheistic conception does not correspond to the primitive corporeal outlook referred to by Rabbad, a point he was presumably aware of, his identification with the simple believers of medieval times is significant. Even after the philosophical triumph of God's incorporeality, later thinkers still occasionally express themselves in ways that seemingly contradict this. Perhaps some of them were even anthropomorphous without realizing it, to use Rabbi Abraham Maimonides' words in describing the French rabbis who opposed Maimonides. For example, Rabbi Israel Lipschitz, 1782 to 1860, writes that Moses, unlike the other prophets, saw, as it were, God's reflection. Obviously, there must be a substance to cause a reflection, unless Lipschitz means that he saw the reflection in a vision. Rabbi Moses Gentili, 1663 to 1711, offers a similar comment in his discussion of Numbers chapter 14, verse 9. Their defense, literally shadow, is removed from over them, and the Lord is with us, fear them not. Gentili explains that it is the nature of a shadow to shrink until it entirely disappears. If the body casting the light is greater than the darkened body, he continues, and God, who is the body that shines, is with us. Therefore, do not fear them, for our light is greater than their darkness. The 18th century Svarat Harivash, which purports to record the testament of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, 1700 to 1760, states that one should always be happy and think and believe with perfect faith that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is at his side and watches over him, and one should look upon the Creator. Blessed be he, and the Creator will look upon him. The anthropomorphic element of this passage was actually cited by the infamous Mitnagid Rabbi Avigdor ben Yosef Hayim of Pinsk, lived in the 18th and 19th centuries, in his memorandum to the Russian government against Hasidic Jews. Commenting on this passage, he wrote, "With this we see how the wicked express insolence against God and praise themselves falsely, saying that they see the Creator as if he has a form. With this they deny the Torah of Moses, in which all the nations of the world believe. As a result of this, they are against all the nations." Rabbi Avigdor did not mention that just a few paragraphs earlier, Svarat Harivash discusses seeing the Creator with the mental eye, which certainly reflects a non-corporeal understanding of God. The Talmud, Hagiga 15a, states, "On high there is no sitting and no standing, no division and no cohesion." This text is cited by Maimonides in the third principle as well as in other places in support of, for his assertion that God as an incorporeal being cannot be described as being in movement or at rest. However, Rabbi Samuel Edel's Maharsha, 1555 to 1632, one of the most outstanding Talmudic commentators, understands this passage to refer to the angels alone and not to God. This is so for God, unlike the angels, indeed sits, as Micah stated, "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne." Thank you, Barista. Have a happy and healthy Pesach. Rabbi Yaakov Isaac Horowitz, died 1815, the seer of Lublin, writes that there are people who actually see God, and that one of these was Abraham. Before his circumcision, God only appeared to Abraham's soul, but after Abraham's circumcision, even his body could behold God. The seer of Lublin would have been quick to point out that he was referring to a spiritual, incorporeal vision, but from a Maimonidean standpoint, a vision apprehended by the physical eyes is by definition not incorporeal. Finally, what is one to make of the following story told by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who's still alive? When I was a young man, I met someone in Israel who was at the time a very important political personality. We were talking and he asked me, where does God put his legs? For a moment, I didn't understand. I thought he was joking, but he was asking this question seriously. And I tried to tell him that, as far as I knew, God has no legs. He told me I did not know what I was talking about as a religious person because his father truly believed that God has legs. I tried to remonstrate. I opened the Siddur and showed him that not only do we not believe that, but we should not. It is forbidden. He ended the conversation by telling me that he was very friendly with the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir and that he would warn him that there was a person in Jerusalem who should be destroyed. Wow, that's pretty intense stuff. I hope no one goes from this stream and warns the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir that I should be destroyed. Although Maimonides is adamant that even children must be instructed in God's incorporeality, I bet this politician was either Sephardic or Mizrahi. I can't believe that an Ashkenazi politician would be this stupid. Not everyone held to this position. Thus, in the medieval Sefer Hasidim, we are told that the teacher should instruct children that God lives in heaven and that he should even point to the sky to illustrate this. I have no doubt that the author of this passage, who was part of an anti-corporealist milieu, would agree that this description crossed the line of strict theological propriety, but he would nevertheless argue that in the education of children, one need not be bound by such concerns. In fact, Rabbi Ruvain Magilot points out in his notes to the text, the approach of the Sefer Hasidim is based on a story told in the Talmud, Breshit 48a, about Rava and Abaye as children. When asked where God lives, Rava pointed to the roof and Abaye went outside and pointed to the sky. Upon seeing this, Rava commented to the boys, both of you will become rabbis. It is possible that this tolerance of childish anthropomorphism has a parallel intolerance of anthropomorphism that was never intended to be taken seriously. This would explain the artistic personifications of God that have not been entirely absent from post-Maimonidean Jewish history. Indeed, as late as 1540, 1698, and 1742, we have title pages from rabbinic works with images of God. Whoa. Whoa. Okay, let's go to the videotape. Let's see that. Okay, so here, this contains images of God in a Siddur, which means a Jewish prayer book. And more images. Wow, very heretical, very racy stuff. I'm not sure I should be showing this in front of the Gentiles. Maybe this won't make the Jews look good. Oy vey. Now, this certainly does not mean that Jews at these late dates believe in a corporeal God. Such examples are indeed rare. In fact, it is probably because there was general agreement that God is incorporeal that some tolerance was given to Jewish artists in portraying God in a physical form, or to the use of such portrayals from non-Jewish artists if that was the case. In any event, these examples of an anthropomorphic God are certainly very un-Maimonidean. In concluding our discussion of the third principle, one more point must be noted. There is no question that, according to Maimonides, a corporealist has no share in the world to come. This is such an important principle that even children, women, stupid ones, and those of a defective natural disposition must be instructed in it. Please press 1 in the chat if you're either a child, a woman, a stupid one, or have a defective natural disposition. One who believes that God is corporeal, by definition, denies God's unity and is even worse than some types of idolater. It is irrelevant whether or not this mistaken belief is unintentional. Wow. Having said this, Maimonides must explain why the Torah used corporeal expressions to refer to God. His answer is striking. Since the masses need to be instructed in God's existence but could not conceive of the existence of an incorporeal God, it was necessary for them to be led to this belief in a progressive fashion. First, they were taught of the existence of one corporeal God, which was an improvement to believing in many corporeal gods or having no belief. Only following this were they taught about God's incorporeality. Maimonides does not tell us if this process was to be accomplished quickly or took a number of generations. As Howard Kreisel has noted, it follows from Maimonides' remarks that the Torah deliberately misleads the people in the matter of the corporeality of God. The Torah has no choice but to compromise with reality to educate the people effectively. Whoa! The Torah deliberately misleads the people in the matter of the corporeality of God. It has no choice but to compromise with reality to educate the people effectively. So for the people with IQs under 115, the Torah has to use this figurative language about God's corporeality. Here we are not dealing with a population that understood the Bible in a corporeal sense, rather than turning to the wise men for guidance. Rather, and this is what is so significant, it was the Torah which originally intended the masses to accept God's corporeality. It's not merely that the Torah misleads the people, but rather that the Torah taught them a heretical doctrine. Must be emphasized that for an ancient Israelite to believe in God's corporeality was actually an improvement over his earlier state when he had no belief in God. Only when the ancients advanced beyond this stage would they be able to understand the anthropomorphic expressions in the Torah to be understood figuratively. One of the ancients died without having rejected a corporeal conception of God. He would suffer the consequences of his heresy, namely denial of a share in the world to come. Once again, it must be noted that the spiritual consequences of heresy not to be viewed as a punishment, but rather as a necessary outcome of the world's metaphysical structure. An incorporeal conception of God is a basic necessity for intellectual perfection at all times and places. Got that, guys? That the Torah taught a heretical doctrine is certainly a radical position for Maimonides to take. Maimonides explains that both the Torah and the sages use positive attributes with reference to God, since the masses are unable to achieve a representation of him otherwise. Now, although the Torah speaks in the language of men, the fact remains that one who continues to regard God as having positive attributes has abolished his belief in the existence of the deity without being aware of it. The far-reaching nature of this statement is grasped when one sees that, according to Maimonides, not only is one not supposed to instruct the masses regarding God's attributes, but the Torah even regards it as necessary for the masses to believe in positive attributes, such as the notion that God displays anger. What is wrong with using AD and BC for dates? Well, AD means Anno Domini, so if you don't believe that we're living in the year of our Lord, it would be bizarre to use a Christian form of dating. And BC stands for before Christ. If you don't believe that Jesus is the Christ, then it would be bizarre to adopt Christianity's form of dating. It is effectively saying that you accept the truth of Christianity. The far-reaching nature of this statement is grasped when one sees that, according to Maimonides, not only is one not supposed to instruct the masses regarding God's attributes, but the Torah even regards it as necessary for the masses to believe in positive attributes, such as the notion that God displays anger. Thus, although the Torah intends the masses to hold these beliefs to create a stable society, the result is that they effectively deny the existence of God. Although this certainly appears to be unfair to the masses, I think Maimonides would argue that it is not the Torah that is responsible for these people having no share in the world to come. As far as he is concerned, anyone who believes in positive attributes is, in any event, unable to achieve the intellectual perfection required for immortality. And when I look at the chat, I realize so many of you just lack the intellectual perfection required for immortality. Even detect some distinct homosexual tendencies. in the chat, which makes me very sad. So what are positive attributes of God? So when you say God has anger or anything about God, when you're attributing something to God, then those are positive attributes. So Maimonides said that really all we can say about God is in negative attributes. We really don't know what God is. So when we say God is a unity, all we're really saying is that he is not divided. When we say God is eternal, all we're really saying is that God is not mortal or limited or bound. So Maimonides believed that we cannot know anything about God. All we can know is what God is not. Thus, although the Torah intends the masses to hold these beliefs to create a stable society, the result is that they effectively deny the existence of God. Maimonides might also wonder why the masses would even be interested in the immortality he has in mind, which is, after all, completely intellectual and reserved exclusively for the philosophically enlightened. Please press 1 if you are philosophically enlightened and want this kind of completely intellectual immortality. Having said this, it is interesting that Maimonides does, in fact, justify the punishment of the corporealist who does not know any better or who was led to his heretical beliefs from what he saw in Scripture. Maimonides comments in the Guide to the Perplexed, there is no excuse for one who does not accept the authority of men who inquire into the truth and are engaged in speculation if he himself is incapable of engaging in such speculation. However, it would seem that Maimonides' justification is directed at those who do not grasp his true beliefs. The philosophers are aware that the attainment of immortality is not related to any questions of fairness and that God does not need to be justified for withholding this reward. For Maimonides, the attainment of immortality by means of intellectual perfection is a natural process and not a reward. Thus, there is no difference between the example given by Maimonides and a person who grows up on a desert island and therefore has no wise men to turn to for instruction about God. Since neither of them has achieved the minimum measure of intellectual perfection, their intellects cannot live on. I'm afraid this is true for so much of the chat. I fear that you have not achieved the minimum measure of intellectual perfection, and therefore your intellects cannot live on. This is not me speaking. This is the Maimonides speaking, the Rambam. Sad but true. Sad but true. So why did Matisyahu stop being Hasidic? It's a very difficult life, and so particularly when you are a performer, and there are just so many restrictions on you as a Hasidic Jew. Most people who are Hasidic Jews are born into it. It's a very difficult thing to take on later in life and maintain. So he took it on for a while. It helped launch his career. It made him interesting and edgy, but I'm sure he found it an inconvenience. So when the restrictions of Hasidic Judaism really began to bite, then he decided to move on. Okay, so go forth, pursue intellectual, philosophical perfection, and maybe your intellects will live on. Bye-bye.